Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today as we continue our masterclass series. I'm honored here at Liberating Cinema to welcome our director and speaker for today, Lana Gogoberidze, a really legendary filmmaker who I'm really grateful that we can have with us today. First of all, I have to thank the Chase Arts and Humanities Research Council UK for their generous support, and also the Georgian National Film Centre for their partnership as well. I will start by saying a short introduction about Mrs. Gogoberidze, and then we will proceed with the masterclass. So, Lana Gogoberidze was born in 1928 in Tbilisi. She is a prolific film director whose films primarily focus on realistic, non-sentimental portrayal of women's lives. Her films have been selected at major festivals, and she has been a major voice in cinema since the 1950s and 60s. Before enrolling in the State Institute of Cinematography, GIK, in Moscow, she had originally planned on becoming a literary scholar, and is also very well known for her work, as well as cinema in poetry and in translating poetry. She has been a jury member at major film festivals and was elected to the Parliament of Georgia, and has then been a representative of Georgia to the Council of Europe. Furthermore, she has also been one of the initiators to found the National Film Center in Georgia, a wonderful initiative, and has translated and has worked on much on promoting the Georgian-French friendship, and has received the French National Order of the Legion of Honor. She's a recipient of the State Award of the USSR and of the Georgian SSR, as well as a title holder of the People's Artist of the Republic of Georgia. Her films continue to be shown, and she's an honorable president of the Art International Women's Association, AIWA, and a board member of the Georgian Film Academy. Currently, she also comes from, in a way, one can say, from a dynasty of filmmakers, and has been working and is currently working on a film about her mother, Nutsa Gogoberidze, also a pioneering Georgian filmmaker in the Soviet Union. Thank you, Lana. If I start, I'm grateful to have you here with us. I would start off by asking you if you could tell us about the beginning, how you came to cinema, because it would be good to hear this journey from you, because I understand your journey was quite special. And I would like to hear how you came to cinema and about your background, both related to your family and your upbringing, but what you think is important for us to know.
Thank you very much for this interest towards my person. Well, how I came to cinema, yes, it was not so easy for me, because at the time when I finished the first my school, it was impossible for me to go to Moscow and begin studies in filmmaking. Everything was centralized at that moment in Soviet Union. There was only one film school. It was in Moscow. And for me, it was forbidden, because my father was arrested, my mother too. My mother passed 10 years in exile after she was filmmaker, her first life, to say so. Yes, and then in 1953, Stalin died. And after this, I could achieve this what I wanted, go to Moscow and begin my studies in cinema. And so afterward, when I finished the school, there were all possibilities in Soviet Union to make films, really.
When you started your production, I was intrigued by, perhaps if we speak directly about your films, I was very much intrigued about how you portray the lives of your characters, both inner lives, but also the wider social and political climate in which they live. In your films, your characters. So if you could tell us a little bit about your approach to cinema and how you portray, in particular, women's lives, and why this is interesting for you.
Yes, no, I was always making films about something which was really very, very important for me. I never made simply some kind of a film to make film. At first, maybe it was my mother who influenced me really whole my life, because when she was 34 years old, she was arrested and her career of filmmaker finished at that moment. I never saw her films till some 4 or 5 years ago. I saw her films, but I knew that she was a filmmaker. And when she returned, I realized that she was a very, very interesting personality, really, very deep, very creative, and very close for me, close person for me. And maybe it was the cause why in all my films I was speaking about women, about women's life, about women who dare their life, who are struggling with their fate. Sometimes they can win, sometimes not, but they are always struggling to achieve something which they feel important. And so I became filmmaker unconsciously.
This aspect of what you said, struggling with their faith and portraying their lives, would you say, perhaps if we speak at this point a little bit more about your mother, because I think the image of the mother, and in particular, appears in your films. So if you tell us a little bit about more about your mother's work and how you positioned yourself as well in a way, what your relationship is of your films to your mother's films in a way. Because it's interesting also that you say she had a big influence, but you've never seen her films until perhaps a few years ago. So this is a very kind of, there's several layers, if you will.
You know, it's an interesting question, really, because when my mother died, I didn't know what kind of cinema she made, because she never spoke about her cinema. It was forgotten by everybody, and I think that she also decided to forget this time. And she was never speaking about her films. So I can't say that I was influenced by my mother's work, of course, but by her personality, yes. I was influenced by her personality, and that was what I wanted to express when I was making some episodes of her life in my films. And you know, now I'm making a film about my mother.
Yes.
Now I'm making a documentary about my mother. I think that it can be interesting because it is a fate which was in the same time very exceptional, because she was filmmaker and she made very interesting films now, really, which are now shown everywhere in the world, and everywhere they are received very, very warmly, and with a lot of articles and so on about her everywhere. And in the same time, it was a case of millions of women which were arrested in the time of great terror in Soviet Union, and arrested simply as a wife of member of family of enemy of people, and nothing else, without judgment, without trial. Simply, they were members of family. And that means that they were not personalities, they were nothing, only additional thing to the husband. And they could be so arrested. Millions and 10 millions and more of women in Soviet Union were arrested and sent to exile in Siberia, in far north. That was my mother's case. And they passed there 10 years and even more in exile. And I think that it's really interesting because she was a very creative person, and she was so cut from everything for her life, from her friends, from family, from her daughter. She had only one daughter, me. And then when she returned afterwards, she was included in my life, really, and she became a very, very important person in my life, and not only in my life, but of everybody whom she met.
Mhm. So would you say this had an impact also on your own work, in terms of your films? Because your films, it's interesting that you say this element of also persecution and this history, because your films in particular, they have a lot of joy in them. Despite showing a lot of difficulty, you have a wonderful ability when one watches your work. There's a documentary aspect, but then there's also this aspect in which you bring a lot of joy to material, which is often very difficult. So even if we speak about films like your first films we had spoken about, Under One Sky or I See the Sun, to some of your later work, like some interviews on personal matters or Day is Longer Than Night. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about your films themselves and in relation to this.
Yeah, despite this objectively tragical story of my life personally, I can't say that I was unhappy. It's maybe strange, but this feeling of joy was very intense in our life generally. And at all photos, if you see my photos of the time, I am everywhere smiling. It is even strange because everything happened, awful things happened in not only in my life, but generally in life of our society. But we enjoyed life, we loved life. Maybe it is a character of Georgian. It is somehow such a quality as the French bon vivant. C'est quelqu'un qui aime la vie.
Yes.
Love life, and we loved life, really. And we lived with this feeling of love, of joy, of friendship, and so maybe it is what you feel in my films. Maybe that's why you feel this in my films, because it was my feeling, my perception of life.
This is wonderful. I think it's very important because, as you said, particularly if there's a lot of tragedy, this ability to be transformed is a very important one, and particularly when you express that through your art. This is a good point, I think, to connect. And I would ask you, as you touched nicely upon Georgia, what is this aspect of if you tell us a little bit about what it fascinates you, because I find it fascinating, but I wonder, I would like to hear from you as someone, who's obviously been a filmmaker for so long, to tell us a little bit about Georgian cinema and culture, and in particular, in relation to, as you said, society, but also Soviet society, because I think your perception is quite interesting and different. And now that the Soviet Union does not exist anymore, it's interesting to see, perhaps, to look back. And if you tell us kind of what kind of how life looked, and also how filmmaking looked in your own context.
Yes, it's somehow some kind of paradoxical situation in Soviet Union. On one hand, there was a real censorship, at one hand, you can't imagine that at the time you can say what you want, really, because everything was against it, and especially against national cinemas. For instance, everything was centralized, and everything was decided in Moscow, in so-called Goskino. Goskino, it was called Goskino, governmental cinema. And everything was decided there about films. But on another hand, we had all possibilities to make films, It was so strange that, for instance, for my first film, you mentioned it, Under One Sky, there we had all possibilities to make this huge, really, performance of thousands of people gathering in shooting place and so on, everything. We had no financial problems. If the scenario was accepted, then we had no financial problems. The government financed us as we wanted. It's strange now we have only financial problems. We have liberty, but we have no finances. At that time, we had no liberty, but we were financed as we wanted. Young filmmakers, it is really strange on one hand, but it was really difficult to make cinema in Soviet Union. But I don't know how, but we arranged, to maybe we discovered specific cinema language to speak about what we wanted, to express our feelings, our thoughts, not only by words, because words were very easy to sanction. Words, but the image is more difficult to understand what you want to say by this image. And then our cinema, Georgian cinema, really existed as a phenomena in Soviet Union. And everywhere in the world where we were invited to all festivals, they were speaking not about Soviet cinema, but about Georgian cinema especially. And it was for us something that I loved it really, because we wanted to have our cinema, our national cinema, Georgian culture in general. Because if we have something that distinguishes us from other nations, it's our culture. Our culture is really very old, very interesting, very authentic, and so what I can say about this time is
That's wonderful. I think what you said also, I like the part what you said about the liberty and the finances. And I think
it's a reality, We realized it when we became independent. Then for about 10 years, we could not do cinema at all because we had nothing, no possibility to do it financially. Now it begins little by little, and now still Georgian film exists still. I am very happy to say this because there are a lot of young cineasts now who make good films.
Thank you. I also what you said about the culture, Georgian culture being thousands of years old, it's something that's obviously quite important and expressed through cinema. So, but I wondered also if we can ask you, this is perhaps more a kind of pragmatic question about distribution. How were your films, as well as international festivals, which I know your films were shown at, how were your films received and also distributed across Georgia, but also across the Soviet Union in their time? I mean, because this is something that's very difficult often to find about how people perceived this cinema, as you said, during that time, and also were your films, were they widely distributed, or how were they shown? It's just interesting to know about this aspect.
For the distribution in Soviet Union, it depended not at us. It was a governmental task, and they were distributed everywhere in Soviet Union, almost always. But as to go to festivals, there were difficulties, of course, because in Moscow, they always wanted to send Russian films. It was a taboo, they did not at all to send Georgian film as representative of Soviet Union. For instance, I remember when once there was a call in my home, I answered, and somebody tells me in French, "Je suis Gilles Jacob, directeur du Festival de Cannes." I don't know how he knew my number of telephone, and he knew that I speak in French. And he told me that he wants very much, they decided to have my film at the festival, but in Moscow they were told that I can't send my film, and I am so busy to make my new film that I can't go to Cannes and not send my film also. And he asked me to help them to make something. And then really, I don't know how, but still we achieved it, and my film was presented in official selection at Cannes Festival. It was 84, in 84, 1984. And always it happened so, you know. There were, for instance, when my film, several interviews on personal matters, was wanted to, there were Ulrich and Erika Gregors, if you know them, from Arsenal, founders of Arsenal and Forum of Berlin Film Festival. They wanted my film, and they are now relating how difficult it was to achieve it, to have the film, and what they were told that why you want this film, it isn't interesting, and so on and so on. And at last they had my film, but it was not shown at Berlin Film Festival because there was some. There was a film, Canadian film about refugees, Deer Hunt, who was shown, and then Soviet Union refused to show our films. They were offended by this film and so on. That always there were some kind of this kind, but still our films were shown at festival and received prizes and so on and so on.
Excellent. I think I have perhaps one or two more questions, but I wanted to say if any of our, before I proceed, if any of our audience members have a question, to either send them to me directly and I will ask them, or if you wish to speak, I would ask you to turn your camera on and to raise your hand just so I know if anyone has questions. Finally, just to ask, perhaps I have one more before we get to those questions, just to ask you perhaps is about actually one thing about translation and how film is perceived. I know now there's a bigger project and much of your work has been restored, and we will be showing as well in partnership with the Film Center, Day is Longer Than Night. But I wondered when you originally shot your films, because in the Soviet Union there was this, often films were made also in Russian. Were your films always shot in Georgian, or were they shot in Russian as well, or did you do both, or how did that work in terms of the kind of the language of your films, in terms of the spoken language, I mean?
No, from this point of view, yeah, no, we are quite, we shot our films only in Georgian. Afterwards, they were dubbed in Russian. All our films were dubbed in Russian and shown everywhere in Russian, of course. But in Georgia, they were shown in Georgian, and for us it was even unbelievable to shoot our films in Russian. No, it never happened, never.
Okay, I understand.
My mother's film, at that in 30s, they are in Russian. The titles are in Russian. At that time, it's impossible to make it in Georgian, but we were already somehow free from this point of view.
Good, yes, this is important. This is an important aspect because we often forget, I think, in terms of what language a film is made in this context. But I had a couple of questions from the audience. I wanted to ask. So we have one question, very nice. What has changed since your first works in the late 1950s and early 1960s, and then to your last films? Perhaps related to your personal approach, or even maybe to the conditions to creating art in a society that surrounds you. So, yeah,
a lot of things changed. When I make my first film, then I can tell you this example. I was invited with this film to Berlin. It was my first trip abroad, and my film was shown in Berlin. It was for me an event, a real event. And then I was sitting in this big hall, and suddenly film begins, and I see that it begins with second novel. the film consists from 3 novels, as you know, and my second one, I thought that it was a mistake, of course. I went to projectionist, and I told him that, what are you doing? It isn't the beginning of film. He was very astonished and showed me the book. And then I saw that from Moscow, they sent them film beginning by second novel, because they thought that first one was against Soviet mode of life, because it speaks about Princess Maya, and they were telling me there in Moscow, why you are interested in the feelings of this princess, what Soviet filmmaker can do with it, and so on. And then they simply cut the film, and so then it was such time at that in the 50s when I began to make films, and afterwards it was only one film, how it is,
Limits.
Limits, yeah, the film Limits, which was shot after Perestroika. You know Perestroika in Soviet Union, yeah. It was called so. And at that time, I was really free. We were free to do anything we wanted. It was the only time in Soviet Union we made film without any censorship, really. And afterwards, when I made my first film in independent Georgia, it was a company which financed me. And of course, there was nothing to do with the censorship, of course. And now, as I told you, we are free, but we have no possibility. No, still now we can do films. We can do now films.
Thank you. This is an interesting dialectic and very important to remember, I think. This is a nice way of connecting. We spoke about your earlier work, and this excellent second question as well I have from the audience is related to new filmmakers. I saw that perhaps I didn't mention that you had also influenced, and your students have been famous Georgian directors such as Gogoberidze, Chokeli, and Zaza Urushadze. But it is also important to say, for those who don't know, that your daughter Salomé Alexi is also a filmmaker. And we actually had a very nice question that ties into this to say, it is interesting to see that your daughter is also a film director and actor, and that many of your films displays the relationships between mothers and daughters. So the question is, what is the advice you gave to your daughter when she decided to follow the family tradition in the film world?
I can't say that I influenced her in one way or another, because I think that really the children have to be free and independent in their decisions. She made her studies in Paris, and she is really a very interesting person. She makes her films quite different from my films or from films of my mother, from own point of view, which is always decisive, how you see the world around you. Well, this is interesting always. She has her personal view of, and I think that she has her life and her very good way in cinema. Now she's making a new film just now.
Excellent. So you're both making films, and we look forward to seeing them.
Yeah, I also hope that you'll see them. She received prizes in the Venice Film Festival and so on, and she's already a real filmmaker.
Yes. I perhaps the final question, and then we can look to finish, is how would you say the cinema, you told us a little bit about this tension between the freedom to make and also the limitations with the finance and everything else. But how would you say the state of Georgian cinema is today and culture in terms of the production? You had touched a little bit about it, but perhaps as someone who's worked and grown up in the Soviet Union and had this immense life through cinema, and obviously with your family now, several generations of women who are making films, but from your own perception and also your work, also in the political sphere in Georgia, and more widely in culture, how would you say the contemporary state of cinema is? And what should be improved?
No, I can't say a lot about it, but I'm happy that now today Georgian cinema exists. It's a fact, it's a reality. And that's why there are a lot of, to begin with, MoMA in New York and so on, everywhere in the world, the retrospectives of Georgian cinema. It's a very interesting event, really, it happens because today it's alive, Georgian cinema. That's why all films of young filmmakers, or today's filmmakers, are shown everywhere together with our films and the films also of our predecessors. That's a very interesting event. Together, all this phenomena of Georgian cinema, and it is now alive, and I hope that it will be and will be always.
Thank you very much. This is, I think, a wonderful point to connect with your cinema and the cinema of the state today, and the joy we spoke about, and the fact that it's alive. So again, and this transformation is very important. So I'm very grateful that you took the time to be with us, and I hope we look forward to your work, and I hope we will have the opportunity to speak again.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your interest to our country, towards our country.